The lobby stretched wide and hollow, a cavern of marble and glass designed less for welcome than for order. Light poured in through the high panes, fractured into clinical brightness by steel frames. Every surface reflected something of the machinery of the institution: polished floors that carried no warmth, walls that absorbed no sound, ceilings that made silence seem imposed rather than natural. The colonel entered with deliberate steps. His uniform was pressed with exacting precision, the fabric carrying the weight of decades, years folded into creases, battles stitched into thread. His shoes, blackened to a sheen, struck the floor with small detonations of clarity against the sterile stone. Each sound was swallowed by the space, reduced, like a declaration met with bureaucratic indifference. He carried his ID badge in one hand, not raised but visible. It gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, a small rectangle of authority and recognition. Yet no one asked for it. Clerks shuffled behind desks, their eyes sliding over him with the same indifference given to signage or potted plants. A security camera pivoted silently, its lens gliding past him as if he were data, not flesh. Near the metal detector, a police officer leaned with calculated casualness, weight balanced on one heel, hand resting against his belt. His gaze, unlike the others, fixed sharply. It followed the colonel's movement with an intensity that had less to do with protocol than presumption. A silence stretched between them, invisible but tangible, a cord pulled taut across the space. The colonel did not break stride. He carried himself forward, posture straight, gaze ahead, the set of his shoulders an unspoken refusal to shrink. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the uniform in front of him demanded verification not by rank, but by suspicion. Around them, the lobby persisted in its indifference. The echo of heels on stone, the hushed rustle of papers, the faint hum of ventilation. These were the sounds of a system functioning as intended, a machine of compliance and passage. The colonel's progress, however, altered its rhythm. Each step seemed amplified, each second stretched, as though the environment itself acknowledged the friction now present in its order. The ID badge caught the light again, sharp and momentary, like a flare in the void of routine. It was not lifted. It did not need to be. The colonel knew the ritual, knew the badge was meant to be presented, but the absence of demand was as deliberate as a withheld word. What mattered was not the badge's authority, but the officer's gaze, its weight heavier than any scanner, its judgment swifter than any protocol. The colonel approached the threshold of the detector. He paused briefly, not hesitating, but aligning his body to the space, giving the machinery its due. The officer shifted now, pushing off the post with slow deliberation, each movement announcing itself without sound. The colonel felt it without turning, surveillance no longer ambient but focused, no longer systemic but personal. A man reduced not in stature but in perception to a silhouette under fluorescent scrutiny, and yet he did not look away. His shoes pressed forward again, black against the pale floor, each strike an assertion. The badge remained visible but untouched, still unasked for, still shining under indifferent light. Behind him, doors opened and closed with indifferent rhythm. Ahead, the machinery waited, detectors, scanners, conveyors. But it was the human presence, the watching eyes, that defined the threshold. The silence deepened, heavier than noise. It was the silence of an institution that did not need to speak to declare itself. The colonel entered it. The officer moved before the colonel reached the machine. One step forward, deliberate, the sound of his boot hard against marble. The movement was small but decisive, less a gesture of duty than a declaration of ownership of the space. "Sir." The word carried no courtesy. Flat, clipped, already narrowing the colonel into something less than the sum of his uniform, the colonel stopped. Not abruptly, his posture remained fluid, his presence unbroken, but the stillness was immediate, controlled. He stood with the weight of a man accustomed to scrutiny, to waiting under hostile eyes. His ID badge glinted faintly in his hand, though the officer's gaze never dipped to acknowledge it. "You headed somewhere?" the officer asked, voice lower now, drawn out in the cadence of suspicion rather than procedure. The colonel's answer was silence. It was not the silence of confusion, nor of defiance. It was the silence of certainty, a refusal to dignify the obvious. His posture supplied what words did not: straight back, shoulders squared, chin level. The answer was inscribed in presence, in uniform, in the authority woven into every fold of his attire. The officer lingered in the gap. His hand, resting on the curve of his holster, stayed too long, the gesture casual only in appearance. The weight of it was clear: suggestion, threat, dominance wrapped in routine. Need to see some ID. The words landed heavy, though the badge already caught the light, already sat visible between them. The officer had seen it, had chosen not to. The colonel let the silence stretch again. Around them the air shifted. Clerks paused mid-stride, their shoes hesitating against the floor. Two men near the security desk lowered their voices, murmuring in tones that carried more curiosity than courage. The hum of the ventilation pressed down, louder now against the waiting quiet. Finally, the colonel spoke. His voice was low, steady, unadorned. "You've seen it." The officer's eyes flicked to the badge at last, then back to the man who held it. He did not reach for it, did not step closer, only stood with his hand still touching the holster, thumb tapping lightly against the latch in a rhythm too irregular to be casual. "That doesn't tell me much." His words carried condescension, the kind that disguised itself as authority. "Need more than a badge, Colonel." The rank was spoken like a question, not an acknowledgement. The colonel did not move. His shoes held firm against the sterile floor. His silence now was heavier than before, filling the space with a weight that the officer's voice could not dislodge. It was a silence sharpened into refusal, forcing the officer to speak into the void, again and again, each word sinking without purchase. A small crowd had formed at the edges, 3 clerks by the elevator, a young woman with a visitor's pass near the metal detector, 2 men with briefcases standing apart but listening. Their eyes flickered from officer to colonel, their mouths still, their hands tightening imperceptibly on straps, folders, devices. No one intervened. They became part of the architecture, witnesses folded into the marble and glass. The officer's radio crackled then, abrupt and intrusive. A clipped voice spoke across channels, unintelligible but sharp, the static echoing across the hollow lobby. He touched it with his free hand, muting it swiftly, but the sound had done its work. It had broken the silence, revealed the machinery behind his stance, reminded the crowd that the authority at his hip was not singular, but systemic. "Need you to cooperate," he said finally, voice harder now, stripped of pretense. "This'll go easier if you do." The colonel's gaze remained steady, eyes fixed not on the officer's face, but beyond, through the lobby's glass, where the sunlight fractured into lines against steel frames. His stillness was not passive, it was its own declaration. Every second he refused to bow to unnecessary questioning was a rebuke to the performance of authority in front of him. His silence spoke louder than any retort. The officer shifted again, boots grinding slightly against stone. The holster remained occupied by his hand, thumb brushing the latch with subtle persistence, as if the weapon's presence needed constant rehearsal. The condescension of his tone had sharpened now into tension, an escalation fed not by the colonel's resistance, but by his refusal to grant him power through words. Around them, the crowd lingered. They did not disperse. They did not intervene. They stood suspended between duty and fear, curiosity and complicity. The silence of witnesses carried its own weight, its own indictment. The colonel did not yield, and the officer, though louder, though armed, though backed by the hum of radios and the structure of the building, could not break the stillness that opposed him. The marble floor, the fluorescent lights, the glass walls, all of it seemed to close around the moment. A chamber holding 2 men in a contest of posture, where words mattered less than silence, and silence mattered more than law. The colonel moved with deliberate calm. One hand reached inside his jacket, precise, unhurried, and withdrew a small leather folder. He held it forward, opening it with a practiced motion. Inside lay the unmistakable military credentials embossed with seal, signature, and history. The kind of document that should have ended questions before they began, but it did not. The officer's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, not to read, but to doubt. His lips pressed into a line, his jaw set with something harder than procedure. His own badge glinted at his chest, a rectangle of authority dulled under fluorescent light. Its reflection was harsh, flat, utilitarian. Beside it, the colonel's insignia gleamed with a different weight. Years, campaigns, sacrifices condensed into metal and ribbon. "Could be fake," the officer muttered, not loud enough for the whole lobby, but clear enough for the gathered. The words were meant less for truth than for theatre. The colonel did not flinch. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, without ornament. "It is not." Silence followed, heavy, layered. The officer let it hang, testing whether suspicion alone could outweigh evidence. His hand brushed the credential as though touching it might expose its fraudulence, yet he did not lift it. He only looked from the document back to the man, searching not paper but posture, as if honor itself might betray deceit. The colonel stood immovable. His uniform carried medals that caught the sterile light, flaring briefly with each shift of fluorescent hum. They were not decorations for display, but for memory, each one an emblem of endurance. The officer's badge, by contrast, absorbed light rather than reflected it. A symbol of authority, yes, but authority rooted in enforcement, not sacrifice. "Funny thing," the officer said, voice edged now with condescension sharp enough to cut. "People walk in here wearing all kinds of things. Doesn't make it real." The colonel answered with silence. It was deliberate, crafted. His refusal to argue was itself a statement. Dignity needed no defense. His calm had become weapon, a force more piercing than anger, more enduring than rebuttal. The lobby breathed around them. The witnesses leaned subtly closer, their weight shifting from foot to foot. A man in a grey suit lowered his briefcase. To the ground, hands clasped before him as though bracing for a verdict. A young woman adjusted her visitor's badge, not to read it, but to remind herself she still existed in the room. The air thickened with their unspoken judgment, their muted complicity. The officer, sensing the crowd, hardened his stance. His thumb tapped the latch of his holster again, a rhythm louder in its repetition. He did not draw, did not threaten directly. He only lingered in suggestion. His badge gleamed dully, catching none of the grandeur, only the artificial harshness of overhead light. "You think that uniform means something here?" His words broke the silence, sharp, rhetorical. "This is my lobby, my rules." The colonel raised his gaze at last, not fast, not reactive, but slow, measured, exacting. His eyes met the officer's, unflinching. The space between them felt drawn, taut. Two uniforms standing not in alliance, but in opposition, their meanings at war. When the colonel spoke, his words were stripped bare, devoid of emphasis, yet they carried weight deeper than volume. "I serve this country. That is my credential." The statement landed in the marble chamber with gravity that no badge could match. It echoed, not through sound, but through silence, a resonance held in the stillness of those watching. The officer shifted, unsettled not by evidence, but by the refusal of fear. He leaned closer, as though proximity might break composure. But the colonel remained still, unbroken. The imbalance of authority lay exposed. One man drew power from suspicion, the other from sacrifice. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent yet revealing. They caught on the colonel's medals, casting fragments of brightness that spoke of service beyond the lobby's sterile walls. They dulled on the officer's badge, leaving it flat, metallic, unyielding. The silence returned, deeper now. No words could balance what had been revealed, and still the colonel stood. The lobby had changed. It was no longer the neutral chamber of stone and glass it had been when the colonel first entered. It had become an arena. The crowd was no longer incidental. They had gathered in quiet rings, some openly watching, some pretending at distraction while stealing glances. A woman clutched her handbag to her chest, knuckles whitening. Two young men leaned against the elevator wall, phones raised at hip level, lenses blinking red in furtive recording. Even those who stood with arms folded, faces blank, betrayed their attention by the angle of their bodies. Silence no longer belonged solely to the colonel. It now stretched across the onlookers, growing heavier as each person decided what their role would be: witness, chronicler, accomplice. None intervened, none spoke. Their solidarity was quiet, fragile, easily mistaken for passivity. But it existed. The officer felt it. His shoulders stiffened, the tilt of his chin sharpening. His hand slid from holster to belt, fingers splaying with theatrical authority. His voice rose, not to the colonel, but to the crowd that wasn't supposed to exist. Step back, folks. Nothing to see here. The lie was transparent. Everything to see was here. A murmur rippled anyway, soft, restrained, but present. Words too low to decipher carried across marble like wind through cracks. Phones shifted slightly higher, no longer pretending. Screens glowed faintly in palms. The officer's eyes flickered to them, and in that flicker lay the fracture of his confidence. He barked sharper now, louder than protocol required. I said, "Step back," but the crowd did not. They were not brave, but they were rooted. The weight of the moment held them, unwilling to scatter, unwilling to pretend blindness. The colonel did not move. His stillness was magnified now by comparison, the single, unmoving axis around which everything else shifted. His posture, calm and unbroken, cast the officer's movements into exaggeration, his volume into overcompensation. A security camera above rotated with mechanical precision, its red light blinking in intervals too steady to ignore. It recorded without judgment, but its presence added to the indictment of the scene. Every blink was a reminder that memory was being stored elsewhere, beyond the crowd, beyond the officer's control. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The sound was faint yet constant, underscoring the silence between words. They illuminated without mercy, flattening shadows, making every twitch, every bead of sweat, every shift of posture visible. The building itself seemed complicit, its architecture amplifying the absurdity of the standoff, its cold geometry pressing down on both men. The officer squared his stance, chest out, as though enlarging his body might fill the widening gap between his authority and his control. He stepped closer. His words came sharp, almost spat. "You think this is a game?" The colonel did not answer. His silence again was not absence, but presence. It was refusal turned into indictment. The crowd exhaled as one, an almost inaudible sigh, not of relief, but of recognition. They saw it too. The imbalance, the absurdity, the degradation of a man whose service had been recast as suspicion. Some hands tightened around phones, others around bags or folders, as if holding on to something physical could anchor them to their inaction. The officer's radio crackled again, a voice breaking through the static. He silenced it quickly, his hand pressing down harder than necessary on the device, as if embarrassed by the intrusion. The sound, however, lingered in memory, reminding everyone that the officer was not alone, that his authority was networked, systemic, reinforced. Still, against that weight, the colonel stood. He did not raise his voice, did not move forward or back. His silence made the officer's threat sound thinner, his posturing more fragile. Each second that passed, each blink of the security camera, made the officer's performance appear less like enforcement and more like harassment. The building itself seemed to hold time longer than it should. Seconds dragged, elongated, thickened into minutes. Every sound, the squeak of a shoe, the cough of a clerk, the hum of light, was magnified by the waiting. And through it all, the colonel did not yield. The crowd shifted once more, closer than before, not in distance but in attention. They were no longer pretending to ignore. They were witnesses now, drawn into complicity by their silence, but refusing invisibility. Their whispers grew, threads of unease, fragments of courage, none yet whole. The officer raised his voice again, louder, harsher, but each word fell heavier, less convincing, swallowed by the enormity of the silence facing him. The absurdity was complete. The medals on the colonel's chest caught another flicker of light, gleaming briefly against the dull badge opposite. One shimmered with memory, the other glared with suspicion. Both were metal, but only one carried weight. The standoff persisted. The building held its breath, and the silence, louder than command, became the scene's final judge. The tension snapped, not with a shout but with footsteps, measured, deliberate, echoing from the far end of the lobby. Shoes striking marble, each sound amplified by the hollow geometry of the chamber. The crowd turned before the officer did, their whispers cutting off, their attention shifting in unison. A man entered, suit pressed, tie dark, presence unmistakably administrative. His pace was unhurried but purposeful, the stride of someone who belonged in the marrow of this building. His badge gleamed at his chest, but it was not the badge that spoke first. It was his bearing, shoulders squared without strain, eyes sharp, expression controlled. The officer straightened reflexively, posture betraying unease. His hand slid from belt to side, as though disassociating from the holster that had anchored him minutes before. His voice, when it came, faltered in volume. "Sir, I was—" The official's gaze cut through him before the sentence could form. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The timbre of authority carried in its clarity. "Colonel," the title landed like a verdict. Recognition immediate and unambiguous. The official's eyes shifted, meeting the colonel's, acknowledgement written in their steadiness. In that moment, the balance of the room shifted entirely. The colonel inclined his head, nothing more. He did not speak. His posture remained unbroken, as if he had been waiting for nothing but this inevitability. The official turned back to the officer, and now his words were sharp, surgical, cutting through the pretense of procedure. "Explain yourself," the officer stammered, words spilling without order. "I was just verifying credentials, sir. Suspicious behavior near the—" "Suspicious?" The official's interruption was swift, precise. "That is a United States Army colonel." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of the rebuke, the collapsing pretext of authority. The officer's mouth opened once more, but nothing coherent emerged. His gaze dropped, no longer steady, no longer defiant. The dull gleam of his badge caught the fluorescent light, but now it looked small, almost fragile. The crowd exhaled collectively. Phones lowered slightly, not concealed, but no longer urgent. The murmurs ceased. The architecture itself seemed to shift, the tension draining from stone and steel, the fluorescent hum no longer oppressive, but clarifying. The colonel did not move. He remained still, composed, his silence deeper than ever. It was not silence born of refusal now, but of judgment, leaving the words to those who had power to correct. The official's voice came again, colder this time, directed with precision. "You will stand down immediately." The officer's chin dipped, a nod that was closer to surrender than acknowledgement. His hand hovered briefly at his side, fingers twitching, before settling limp. His gaze remained lowered, fixed on the sterile floor that reflected nothing back. The sharpness of the official's voice had broken the monotony of the scene, cutting it cleanly in two. Before and after. The confrontation no longer belonged to the officer. It was over. The lobby seemed to breathe again, yet the silence remained louder than applause could have been. No one cheered, no one spoke. The weight of the moment demanded restraint. The colonel, unbroken throughout, allowed a single step forward. Not hurried, not hesitant. A step that reclaimed the space, that reset the balance of dignity within its marble confines. His medals caught the light again, not as ornament, but as fact. The officer stood smaller now, shrunk under the rare weight of accountability. His lowered gaze revealed what words could not, the collapse of his performance. the stripping of his authority by a voice sharper than his own. The official's eyes lingered on him one last time, delivering a silence harsher than any reprimand. Then he gestured toward the colonel, a motion of respect rather than instruction. "Proceed, Colonel." The words were simple, but in them lay the restoration of order, not the officer's brittle order, but one rooted in recognition. The colonel inclined his head once more, nothing excessive, and walked on, his posture unchanged, his silence intact. The echo of his shoes returned to the marble floor, steady, unbroken, and as he passed beyond the threshold, the lobby remained suspended in the aftermath. The officer stood diminished. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers quiet but certain, carrying the memory with them. The cameras blinked on, red lights recording not only the harassment but its end. The silence that followed was the truest rebuke. It did not fade quickly. It lingered, long after the words had stopped, long after the footsteps had gone. The system, for once, had corrected itself. Rare, undeniable, and witnessed. The colonel walked forward, not faster, not slower, only steady. His shoes struck the marble with the same cadence as when he had entered, though the sound now carried differently. Each step echoed longer, as if the lobby itself acknowledged what had passed. He did not look back. The crowd, loosened from its suspension, began to dissolve. Phones slid back into pockets, eyes averted quickly, the fragile solidarity dispersing as though it had been borrowed for a moment and must now be returned. No one spoke aloud. The silence held longer than any murmur could have. It was the silence of witnesses who understood they had seen something not extraordinary, but systemic. An encounter that revealed what usually remained invisible. The officer lingered behind, his figure smaller, diminished by the stillness of accountability. His badge no longer commanded attention. It hung inert against his chest, reflecting only the flat fluorescent glare. The official had departed as well, his authority sharp and brief, an incision in the moment before receding back into the corridors of administration. The correction was real, but it was not enough to undo the architecture that had allowed the confrontation to unfold. The colonel knew this. His shoes carried him deeper into the building. The corridors stretched long, sterile, lined with framed regulations and polished plaques that reflected nothing of the individuals who passed by them. The hum of fluorescent bulbs followed him, a constant reminder of the machinery that governed not only light but behavior, expectation, hierarchy. Here in this place of stone and glass, bias did not arrive in shouts or banners. It arrived in glances held too long, in questions asked without need, in suspicion cast not on actions but on existence. It lived in lobbies, in metal detectors, in uniforms worn by men who mistook enforcement for power. The colonel's silence had met it, not with spectacle, but with endurance. His stillness had been louder than anger, more condemning than argument. That was its own kind of resistance, the kind that endured without demanding, the kind that exposed injustice by refusing to bend beneath it. His footsteps echoed again, steady, resilient. Each strike against the floor was not triumph, it was survival, persistence, the measured rhythm of dignity that refused to be erased. Behind him, the lobby returned to its usual rhythm. Clerks walked briskly. The security camera blinked on, the ventilation hummed, the marble floor shone. But the memory lingered, even in that return to order. It lingered in the silence of the crowd as they stepped back into their routines. It lingered in the officer's lowered gaze. It lingered in the unbroken posture of the colonel, a figure who had passed through scrutiny without conceding to it. The system had revealed itself, not in words, not in policies pinned to bulletin boards, but in a single interaction, an interruption, a refusal, a correction. The system was the lobby itself, bright, cold, indifferent, yet alive with unseen currents of bias and control. And within it walked individuals, some who bent, some who enforced, some who resisted. The colonel's figure diminished down the hall, shoes still echoing against marble. He carried no outward sign of victory. He did not need one. His silence had already spoken. His posture had already judged. his presence unbroken, was itself the verdict, and the building, its hum, its lights, its polished surfaces, could not erase that sound. The rhythm of shoes striking stone, steady, deliberate, enduring, the echo would remain, even after the man himself was gone.